My family flew my sister to London and gifted her a $7,000 watch for her birthday, leaving me a half-eaten fridge cake for mine. I didn't scream or cry. I simply took my spare key and financially ruined them. Before we continue today's story, we have an urgent announcement to make. Due to technical issues, we are pivoting towards another channel. Please subscribe to our new channel, Kin and Karma. You can find the link in the video description, the pinned comment, and the collaboration tag on this video. Make sure to switch over now so you don't miss out. Thank you for your support. Now back to the story. The thermometer on my nightstand read 102 degrees, a glaring red digital output that perfectly matched the burning sensation deep within my chest. I had been battling a severe case of stress-induced pneumonia for the better part of 2 weeks, a direct result of working 80-hour weeks to untangle the latest mess my parents had made of their tax liabilities. My apartment was quiet, save for the ragged, shallow sound of my own breathing and the relentless, driving rain hitting the bedroom window. I was 32 years old today. I reached out with a trembling hand, my joints aching with the effort, to grab my phone from the bedside table. I was hoping, perhaps against all logical precedent, for a phone call. A simple 5-minute conversation from my mother, Helen, or my father, Arthur. Instead, the screen lit up with a single, sterile text message from a group chat I was rarely active in. "We totally forgot. Happy late birthday. Cake is in your fridge, dropped it off Tuesday." The text was from Helen. There was no phone call. There was no card. There was only a casual, almost cheerful admission of my complete erasure from their minds. My thumb hovered over the screen, my chest tightening with something far heavier than the illness settling in my lungs. Slowly, painfully, I navigated to Vanessa's social media page. My sister, younger by 3 years, the golden child whose path through life had been paved with silk while I laid the bricks. Her profile was a glowing, high-definition broadcast of absolute luxury. The first image was a perfectly framed shot of a velvet box resting on a white tablecloth at a Michelin-starred restaurant in Mayfair, London. Inside the box rested a gleaming, diamond-encrusted watch. The caption read, "Early 29th birthday surprises from Mom and Dad. They flew me to London for a gala." Blessed family love, the price tag for that specific timepiece, I knew intimately, was just over $7,000. I knew this because, as the sole trustee of the family's estate, I was the one who had approved the emergency line of credit they claimed was for critical home repairs. I forced myself out of bed, the room spinning slightly as my bare feet hit the cold hardwood floor. I wrapped a heavy fleece blanket around my shoulders and shuffled down the hallway to my small kitchen. I opened the refrigerator door, the harsh white light illuminating the nearly empty shelves. Sitting on the middle rack, next to a carton of expired milk, was a generic, plastic-wrapped grocery store cake. It was missing 3 slices. The icing was smeared. It was the same cake Helen had brought over on Tuesday when she stopped by to complain about her luggage not being large enough for the London trip. A cake she had eaten a quarter of while sitting at my counter before leaving the rest behind. I stood there in the cold glow of the refrigerator, staring at the physical manifestation of my worth to my family, a half-eaten, discarded afterthought. I had spent my entire adult life as their shield, their accountant, their responsible shadow, sacrificing my own peace, my own savings, and now my own health to maintain their illusion of grandeur. I closed the refrigerator door. I didn't cry. The tears simply refused to come. Instead, a profound, icy clarity washed over me, crystallizing every ounce of hurt into pure, unadulterated resolve. The financial bleeding I had managed for years was exhausting, but this profound, casual erasure of my existence was a betrayal far worse than any physical diagnosis. The silence in my apartment felt different now. It was no longer the silence of a sick room, it was the quiet of a war room. I walked over to the kitchen island, pulling my phone back toward me, and dialed Helen's international number. The line rang 3 times before she picked up, the background noise an immediate, chaotic symphony of clinking glasses, classical strings, and loud, sophisticated chatter. "Luna," Helen's voice sounded strained, annoyed by the interruption. Sweetheart, I can hardly hear you. We are at the pre-gala reception at the Savoy, and the acoustics in here are just dreadful. I saw the watch, Mom, I said, my voice barely more than a raspy whisper, yet steady and devoid of the emotional crack she was likely expecting. Oh, the watch, Helen laughed a light, breathy sound that grated against my eardrums. Yes, well, you know Vanessa. She's been having such a hard time lately with her influencer career, she really needed a pick-me-up. And turning 29 is such a milestone, we just wanted to make her feel special. Did you find the cake? I left it right there on the shelf so you wouldn't miss it. I found the cake, I replied slowly, gripping the edge of the granite counter until my knuckles turned white. The one you ate 3 pieces of on Tuesday. Luna, please don't be dramatic, Helen sighed, the manufactured cheer instantly vanishing from her tone, replaced by her trademark defensive exasperation. We are in London. We are trying to enjoy a family trip. I don't have the energy to manage your sensitivities right now. You are 32, you are an adult, you can buy your own cake. We love you, of course we do, but Vanessa just needs a little more support right now. I have to go. Arthur is waving me over to meet the ambassador. Feel better, dear. The line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone, the dial tone echoing in the empty kitchen. A family trip. A family trip to which I had never been invited, funded entirely by a well of money I spent every waking hour protecting. I looked down the hallway, past the bedroom, toward the small, locked door of my home office. Next to the door frame hung a small, unassuming brass hook. On that hook rested a single, silver spare key. I walked toward it, my fever momentarily forgotten, driven by a new, mechanical rhythm. I reached out and lifted the cold metal off the hook. They had thought of everything for their perfect London getaway. They had planned the flights, booked the hotel, reserved the tables, and purchased the extravagant gifts. But in their rush to celebrate, they had forgotten one crucial detail. They had forgotten who actually held the keys to the kingdom. I unlocked the heavy oak door of my office and stepped inside. The room smelled of old paper and printer ink. The walls were lined with heavy, fireproof filing cabinets containing the absolute, unvarnished truth of the family's finances. I sat down at my heavy mahogany desk and booted up my encrypted hard drive. The glow of the monitor reflected in my eyes as I pulled up the master trust documents. They were so blinded by the sparkling reflection of the watch they had just bought, they had completely lost sight of the fact that I owned the wrist it sat on. In their rush to celebrate, they had forgotten one crucial detail, and it was a detail that was going to cost them absolutely everything. To understand the depth of this betrayal, one must understand the foundation upon which our family's house of cards was built. My grandmother, a shrewd and brilliant woman who built a real estate empire from nothing, saw exactly who my parents were long before she passed away. She saw Arthur's penchant for investing in flashy, doomed startups and Helen's insatiable need to maintain the appearance of old money aristocracy. When she died 10 years ago, she did not leave her wealth to them. She placed the entire estate into a highly restrictive, irrevocable family trust. And, to their absolute horror, she named me, a 22-year-old recent finance graduate, as the sole, unchallengeable trustee. For a decade, I had been the dam holding back their flood of irresponsibility. I reviewed every budget, denied their more ridiculous requests for yachts and summer homes, and quietly paid off the mountains of credit card debt they accrued in secret, terrified of the social scandal if they ever defaulted. I sacrificed my 20s, my social life, and my own career advancement to manage their chaos. I did it out of a misplaced sense of duty, a desperate desire to keep the family intact, hoping that one day they would look at me with the same adoration they showered upon Vanessa. But the dynamic had shifted significantly 8 months ago with the arrival of Julian. Julian was Vanessa's new fiancé, a man who described himself on his social media profiles as a venture capitalist and visionary entrepreneur, though I had yet to see a single tax return proving he earned a dime. Julian was polished. He wore Italian suits that draped perfectly over his shoulders, drove a leased sports car, and possessed a smooth, practiced charm that immediately captivated Arthur and Helen. Julian was the poison in the well. From the moment he entered our lives, he recognized me as the obstacle between him and the family fortune. I remembered the first dinner he attended at my parents' sprawling, heavily mortgaged estate. He had leaned across the table, swirling a glass of expensive Bordeaux that I had paid for, and smiled at me with eyes that were cold, calculating, and entirely dead. "So, Luna," he had purred, his voice dripping with condescension. "Arthur tells me you manage the grandmother's little nest egg. Must be quite a burden for someone. In your position, have you ever dared liquidating some of the principal? The market is ripe for aggressive expansion. It seems a shame to just let it sit there, stagnating, while the family has to beg for an allowance." I had politely informed him that the principal was legally protected and designed for long-term generational security, not short-term gambles. Julian had simply smirked, turning back to my parents with a look of shared, weary pity. Since that night, Julian had been systematically whispering in their ears, convincing them that I was not protecting them, but controlling them. He painted me as a jealous, bitter spinster hoarding their rightful wealth to punish them for loving Vanessa more. He was the one who suggested the critical home repair loan. He was the one who planned the London trip. He was the architect of their current delusion, manipulating their vanity and entitlement to pry open the vault. Sitting in my office, reading through the ledger of the last 8 months, the pattern became sickeningly clear. Julian wasn't just influencing them, he was bleeding the discretionary accounts dry, funneling the money through Vanessa's influencer expenses to fund his own lavish lifestyle. He had convinced Arthur and Helen that my cautious management was an insult to their legacy. I looked at the specific line item for the $7,000 watch. The funds had been drawn from a secondary emergency account attached to the trust, an account I had authorized for roof repairs on their estate. It was fraud. Plain and simple. Julian had convinced them they were untouchable, that I would always just quietly fix the paperwork as I always had. He thought he had outsmarted the quiet, boring sister. I placed my hands flat on the cool wood of my desk. The fever in my blood had been entirely replaced by a terrifying, absolute calm. Julian wanted to play a game of high-stakes finance with my family's future, using my parents' arrogance as his opening move. But he hadn't read the trust documents. He didn't know the rules, and he was about to find out exactly why my grandmother had chosen me. The heavy oak desk in my home office had always been my sanctuary, a place of order amidst the chaotic storm of my family's financial negligence. But as I sat there, my feverish body trembling slightly under the thick fleece blanket, it became a command center. I pulled the heavy, leather-bound binder containing the original, notarized copies of my grandmother's trust documents toward me. The gold leaf lettering on the spine, the Eleanor Hastings Dynasty Trust, seemed to mock the current state of affairs. I didn't need to read the entire document. I had practically memorized it over the last 10 years. I flipped directly to Section 4, subsection B, tracing my finger down the dense legal text until I found the exact phrasing I was looking for. In the event that the trustee discovers evidence of fiduciary endangerment, gross negligence, or fraudulent misrepresentation of financial needs by the designated beneficiaries, the trustee reserves the unilateral and absolute right to immediately suspend, freeze, or terminate any and all discretionary distributions, lines of credit, and non-essential asset disbursements to protect the principal of the estate. It was a nuclear option. In 10 years of covering their bounced checks, negotiating with their creditors, and quietly selling off minor assets to cover their extravagant necessities, I had never invoked subsection B. I had always believed that cutting them off completely would destroy our family. But looking back at the text message on my phone, that casual, horrific dismissal of my existence on my birthday, juxtaposed against a stolen $7,000 watch, I realized the family I was trying to protect didn't actually exist. They were a parasite, and Julian was a virus accelerating the infection. I opened my secure laptop and logged into the master banking portal for the trust. The screen populated with a dozen different accounts: the principal investment portfolios, the real estate holding accounts, and finally, the discretionary checking and credit lines I maintained for Arthur, Helen, and Vanessa. I clicked on the emergency line of credit, the one explicitly approved under penalty of perjury for structural roof repairs on my parents' estate. The transaction history loaded and my jaw tightened. The $7,000 charge at the Mayfair jeweler was glaringly obvious, but that wasn't all. As I scrolled down, my eyes widened at the sheer volume of recent activity. First-class flights to Heathrow, $22,000. A suite at the Savoy, $14,000. Dining at exclusive restaurants, charges at high-end boutiques, and worst of all, 3 separate wire transfers totaling $45,000 sent to an LLC named Aegis Vanguard Ventures. Aegis Vanguard Ventures, Julian's supposed venture capital firm. My hands flew across the keyboard. I immed. I immediately initiated a system-wide freeze. I revoked the authorization on the emergency credit line. I canceled the platinum cards held by Arthur, Helen, and Vanessa. I suspended the automatic monthly allowances. I locked down every single liquid asset that wasn't directly tied to paying the property taxes and basic utilities of their home. Within 4 minutes, I had entirely severed their financial lifeblood. But I wasn't finished. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in 3 years. It belonged to Marcus Vance, a private investigator and former forensic accountant who had helped me track down some hidden assets during a complicated estate settlement for a client. "Luna," Marcus answered on the second ring, his deep, gravelly voice a comforting sound of competence. "It's late, and you sound terrible. Are you sick?" "I have pneumonia, Marcus, but that's the least of my problems right now," I said, my voice hoarse but completely steady. "I need a rush job, top priority. I need you to run a deep, forensic background check on a man named Julian Sterling. He claims to be a venture capitalist. He's currently engaged to my sister, and I have reason to believe he is actively defrauding my family's trust." "Sterling," Marcus repeated, the sound of a keyboard clacking in the background. "Give me everything you have. Dates of birth, known addresses, LLC names." I fed him the information, emphasizing the transfers to Aegis Vanguard Ventures. "I need to know exactly who this man is, Marcus. I don't care what it costs. Dig into the LLC, dig into his past. I need irrefutable proof by tomorrow." "You'll have it by morning," Marcus promised. "Go get some sleep, Luna. Let me do the heavy lifting." I hung up the phone, but sleep was an impossible concept. I sat back in my leather chair, the glow of the frozen account screens illuminating the darkroom. I poured myself a glass of water, my mind racing through the strategic steps ahead. The trap was set. Now I just had to wait for them to trigger it. The trigger occurred exactly 6 hours later. It was 4:00 a.m. my time, which meant it was 9:00 a.m. in London. I was sitting at my kitchen island, nursing a mug of hot tea and honey, when my phone vibrated violently against the granite counter. The screen displayed an incoming FaceTime call from Arthur. I took a slow, deep breath, adjusting the collar of my robe, and tapped accept. The screen flickered to life, revealing a scene of absolute, chaotic panic. Arthur's face filled the frame, his normally perfectly coiffed silver hair sticking up in odd directions. His face was flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. Behind him, I could see the opulent, gilded lobby of the Savoy Hotel. Helen was in the background, pacing frantically and arguing with a very stiff, very unamused British concierge. Vanessa was sitting on a pile of designer luggage, openly weeping into a silk handkerchief. "Luna, what in the absolute name of God is going on?" Arthur bellowed, completely ignoring the fact that it was the middle of the night for me, or that I was visibly pale and unwell. "My cards are declining, every single one of them. The hotel is demanding settlement for the room before they let us charge breakfast, and the concierge just tried to run the platinum card and it was rejected. Did you mess up the transfer again? Fix it immediately." I took a slow sip of my tea, savoring the warmth in my raw throat. I looked directly into the camera lens. I didn't mess up a transfer, Dad. I froze the accounts. Arthur froze, his mouth hanging open in a comical expression of disbelief. The background noise of the lobby seemed to quiet down slightly as his brain struggled to process the words. You what? Are you insane? We are in London. We are guests of honor at a gala tonight. Unfreeze them this instant, Luna. This is not funny. It isn't a joke, I replied, my voice dangerously soft. Yesterday, you claimed to need an emergency $50,000 line of credit to repair the roof of the estate before it collapsed. A roof repair that is strictly mandated under the preservation clauses of the trust. Today, I logged in to find that money was spent on first-class flights, luxury suites, and a $7,000 diamond watch for the sister whose birthday you managed to celebrate while simultaneously forgetting mine. Helen suddenly pushed her way into the frame, her eyes wide with mascara-stained panic. Luna, you petty, spiteful girl, is this about the cake? Are you really stranding us in a foreign country because your feelings were hurt over a birthday cake? We said we were sorry. This has nothing to do with my feelings, Mother, I said, the absolute coldness in my own voice surprising even me. This has to do with Section 4, subsection B of Grandmother's Trust. Fraudulent misrepresentation of financial needs. You lied to a fiduciary to extract funds for a luxury vacation. That is fraud. As trustee, I am legal. Why obligated to freeze the accounts to protect the principal? Suddenly, the phone was yanked away, and Julian's perfectly manicured face filled the screen. He looked furious, the charming facade completely stripped away, revealing the desperate, cornered rat underneath. Listen to me, you glorified bookkeeper, Julian snarled, dropping his voice to a menacing hiss. You don't understand high finance. You are playing with things way out of your depth. I have bridging loans coming in from my European investors next week. This trip is a networking necessity. You are causing a temporary liquidity issue out of sheer, pathetic jealousy. Turn the cards back on, or I swear to God, I will have my lawyer sue you for breach of fiduciary duty. I couldn't help it, I laughed. It was a dry, rasping sound that hurt my lungs, but it was genuine. Your lawyers, Julian, the ones paid for by Aegis Vanguard Ventures. Julian's face went entirely slack. The color drained from his cheeks so fast he looked as if he might pass out. Yes, I continued, leaning closer to the camera. I saw the $45,000 my parents wired to your firm. You made a severe miscalculation, Julian. You thought because my parents were foolish enough to hand you the keys that the vault was open. But my name is on the vault. The accounts remain frozen. The bank has been notified of the fraudulent charges. You are on your own. Wait, Luna, please. Arthur's voice came back, sounding less angry and more terrified now. How are we supposed to pay the hotel? How are we supposed to get home? I suggest Julian uses some of that visionary venture capital, I said flatly. Or perhaps you can sell the watch. Happy late birthday to me. I ended the call, cutting off the sound of Vanessa's wailing. I set the phone face down on the counter. The silence in my apartment was no longer lonely, it was victorious. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in watching a manufactured reality collapse in real time. My phone became a barrage of escalating desperation. First came the furious texts from Vanessa, calling me a monster, a jealous hag, and a traitor. Then came the bargaining voicemails from Helen, sobbing about the humiliation of being escorted from the hotel and having to fly back to the States on standby, in economy class, using the very last of Julian's personal credit limits. I ignored all of them. I was focused entirely on the massive, encrypted file Marcus had delivered to my inbox at dawn the next day. I sat at my desk, a fresh pot of coffee steaming beside me, as I read through the dossier. Julian Sterling was a ghost, mostly because Julian Sterling didn't exist until about 5 years ago. His real name was Julius Stern. He wasn't a venture capitalist. He was a highly sophisticated, predatory romance scammer with a string of devastated families left in his wake. Marcus had uncovered everything. Aegis Vanguard Ventures was a shell company registered in Delaware, pointing to a P.O. box in a strip mall. The European investors were non-existent. Julius had 2 prior bankruptcies on his record and a standing civil judgment against him in California for defrauding an elderly widow out of her retirement savings. He targeted wealthy, status-obsessed families with vulnerable daughters, used their desire for prestige to gain access to their finances, bled them dry with investment opportunities, and vanished before the checks bounced. He had almost succeeded with my family. If I hadn't checked the ledger on my birthday, he might have drained the secondary accounts completely within the month. At 3:00 p.m. on Thursday, the heavy wooden door to my apartment building buzzed. I didn't need to check the security camera to know who it was. The storm had finally crossed the Atlantic and arrived at my doorstep. I pressed the button to let them up, leaving my apartment door unlocked. I walked back to my dining room table, where I had carefully arranged 3 perfectly neat stacks of documents. I stood at the head of the table, waiting. The door flew open. Arthur, Helen, and Vanessa practically burst into the room. They looked horrific. The flawless, aristocratic veneer had been completely stripped away by 48 hours of travel, sleep deprivation, and sheer panic. Their designer clothes were wrinkled, Helen's hair was flat, and Arthur looked to have aged 10 years. Vanessa was clutching Julian's arm, her face a mask of furious, tear-streaked entitlement. Julian looked like a man walking to the gallows, his eyes darting around the room, assessing the exits. "You sociopath," Vanessa screamed, lunging forward before Julian pulled her back. "You ruined my birthday, you ruined our trip. Julian had to beg his friends to buy us economy tickets home. How could you do this to your own family?" "Sit down," I commanded, my voice cracking through the room like a whip. The absolute authority in my tone caught them off guard. For a decade, I'd been the quiet, accommodating fixer. They had never heard me use the voice I reserved for hostile boardroom negotiations. Arthur puffed up his chest, trying to muster his usual bluster. "We will do no such thing. You are going to transfer the funds to cover the hotel bill, and then you are going to resign as trustee. We are taking you to court, Luna. We are having you declared unfit." "If you take me to court, Dad, you will be the ones going to prison," I said calmly, gesturing to the first stack of papers. "This is the signed loan agreement for the roof repair. You sign this under penalty of perjury. This," I pointed to the second stack, "is the bank statement showing you spent those funds on luxury goods and wire transfers to an unverified third party. That is wire fraud and embezzlement of trust funds. I have already forwarded these documents to the family attorney." Helen gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The fight instantly drained out of Arthur, his face turning an ashen gray. "You're bluffing," Julian sneered, though his voice lacked its usual smooth confidence. "It's a family trust. It's an internal dispute. The authorities don't care about internal family disputes." "They do when there's a history of it," I replied, my eyes locking onto his. I picked up the thickest stack of papers, Marcus's dossier. "Isn't that right, Julius?" The silence in the room became absolute. It was so quiet I could hear the rain tapping against the window panes. Julian's body went completely rigid. Vanessa looked at him, confused. "Julius?" Vanessa asked, her voice trembling. "Who is Julius?" "Your fiancé," I said, sliding a heavily redacted court document across the polished wood of the dining table. "Julius Stern, 2 bankruptcies, 1 civil judgment in California for elder fraud. The founder of Aegis Vanguard Ventures, a shell company with exactly 0 assets, save for the $45,000 my parents illegally wired to him last week." "That's a lie," Julian shouted, taking a step toward the table, his fists clenched. "She's fabricating this. She's trying to frame me because she's jealous of us." "I have the mugshots, Julius," I said, my voice barely a whisper, yet it echoed in the silent room. I pulled out an 8x10 glossy photograph of Julian from a California lockup and tossed it onto the table. "Would you like to explain to Vanessa why you were arrested in San Diego 3 years ago, or should I read the police report to her?" Vanessa stared at the photograph, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. She looked from the mugshot to the man standing next to her. the polished, visionary entrepreneur was gone. In his place stood a panicked, sweating con artist whose entire carefully constructed reality was crashing down around him. The spell was breaking, and the real devastation was only just beginning. The revelation of the mugshot in my dining room should have been the end of it. In a rational world, Arthur, Helen, and Vanessa would have recognized the absolute truth staring back at them from the glossy California Police Department photograph. But desperation is a powerful hallucinogen. Julius did not collapse. He did not confess. Instead, he deployed the ultimate weapon of the cornered con artist, righteous indignation. He slammed his hand on my dining table, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "This is forgery," he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls of my apartment. "You hired someone to digitally alter a photograph. My former business partner, a man named Sterling, had legal troubles years ago. You are conflating our records to ruin my engagement." "Vanessa, look at me. Look into my eyes. Do you really think I am capable of this?" Vanessa, whose entire identity and future were currently tethered to the fantasy Julius had woven, looked from the mugshot to his pleading, handsome face. The cognitive dissonance was too much for her to bear. She chose the fantasy. She grabbed his arm, tears streaming down her face, and screamed at me that I was a monster, a jealous, bitter woman who would stop at nothing to destroy her happiness. Arthur and Helen, utterly paralyzed by the fear of social ruin, chose the path of least resistance. They followed Vanessa and Julius out of my apartment, slamming the door so hard the framed pictures in my hallway rattled. But I knew this wasn't over. Tomorrow was Sunday. Tomorrow was the grand, catered brunch Arthur and Helen were hosting at the estate to officially celebrate Vanessa's birthday and her engagement to the visionary venture capitalist. The entire extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins, and my grandmother's former business associates, would be in attendance. Julius would try to use that public forum to solidify his position, to spin a narrative of my sudden mental breakdown, to invalidate my position as trustee. He had no idea that I had already RSVP'd. Sunday morning dawned crisp and clear, the storm having passed. My feeve. R had finally broken, leaving behind a profound, crystalline focus. I dressed meticulously in a tailored, charcoal gray suit, the armor I wore for my most difficult corporate negotiations. I packed my leather briefcase with the original trust documents, the bank statements, the wire transfer receipts, and the unredacted background dossier provided by Marcus Vance. When I arrived at the estate, the sprawling front lawn was lined with expensive luxury vehicles. The massive oak front doors were open, and the sound of a string quartet drifted out onto the driveway, mingling with the clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the loud, boastful laughter of my father. I walked up the stone steps, my heels clicking rhythmically, a stark contrast to the soft, joyful atmosphere they were attempting to project. I stepped into the grand foyer. The living room was packed with over 50 guests. Caterers in crisp white shirts circulated with silver trays of hors d'oeuvres. In the center of the room, standing by the grand piano, was the guest of honor. Vanessa was wearing a stunning, floor-length silk dress, holding a glass of mimosa, and laughing at a joke Julius was telling to my Uncle Richard, a retired Superior Court judge. Arthur and Helen were standing nearby, their smiles tight, their eyes darting nervously. They were trying desperately to maintain the illusion that the catastrophic events of the past 48 hours had never happened. The moment I entered the room, the temperature seemed to drop. Arthur saw me first. The color instantly drained from his face, his champagne flute hovering halfway to his mouth. Helen gasped audibly, taking a reflexive step backward. Julius stopped mid-sentence, his jaw tightening into a hard, rigid line. I did not hesitate. I walked directly to the center of the room, past the whispers and the confused glances of my extended family. I stopped directly in front of the grand piano. I placed my heavy leather briefcase on the polished mahogany lid. The loud, decisive snap of the brass locks opening cut through the music. "Luna," Uncle Richard asked, his brow furrowed. "We weren't sure you were coming. Helen said you were terribly ill." "I am recovering, Uncle Richard." "Thank you," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the suddenly quiet room. I motioned for the string quartet to stop playing. The musicians, sensing the severe shift in the atmosphere, immediately lowered their instruments. The silence in the room became absolute, thick with tension. I apologize for interrupting the celebration, I continued, turning to address the entire room. I made sure to meet the eyes of every aunt, every uncle, every family friend. But as the sole trustee of the Eleanor Hastings Dynasty Trust, it is my fiduciary duty to inform the extended family of a critical, immediate restructuring of the estate's management. "Luna, please," Arthur hissed, stepping forward, his face a mask of panicked rage. "This is not the time or the place. We are entertaining guests. Let's go to my study." "The time for private conversations ended when you conspired to commit wire fraud, Dad," I replied, my voice perfectly level, utterly devoid of anger. The word fraud dropped like a bomb in the center of the room. A collective gasp rippled through the guests. "Luna, stop this instantly," Helen cried out, her voice shrill with terror. "You are embarrassing the family." "I am saving the family," I corrected her, turning my gaze to Julius. He was slowly backing away toward the French doors leading to the patio, his eyes darting like a trapped animal. "And I am stopping him." I pulled the first document from my briefcase and held it up. 2 days ago, Arthur and Helen signed a legally binding request for a $50,000 emergency disbursement from the trust, swearing under penalty of perjury that the funds were for critical structural repairs to the roof of this estate. I pulled out the bank statements. Instead, those funds were used to fly first class to London, rent a suite at the Savoy, purchase a $7,000 diamond watch, and, most alarmingly, initiate 3 separate wire transfers totaling $45,000 to an entity known as Aegis Vanguard Ventures. Uncle Richard stepped forward, his judicial instincts kicking in. "Aegis Vanguard Ventures? Who controls that entity, Luna?" "He does," I said, pointing directly at Julius. "A man who introduced himself to you all as Julian Sterling, a visionary venture capitalist. But that is not his name, and he has no capital. His legal name is Julius Stern." Julius let out a forced, hollow laugh. "This is absurd. This woman is having a psychiatric episode. She's been obsessed with me since I proposed to her sister. Don't listen to this paranoid delusion." I ignored his pathetic deflection. I reached into the briefcase and pulled out the thick, bound dossier. I handed it directly to Uncle Richard. "This is a comprehensive, forensic background investigation compiled by an independent investigator. Julius Stern has 2 prior bankruptcies. He has no registered securities licenses. What he does have is a standing civil judgment against him in the state of California for defrauding an elderly widow out of her life savings. Aegis Vanguard Ventures is a shell company, registered to a P.O. box, explicitly designed to launder money extracted from manipulated families." The room erupted into shocked whispers. Aunts covered their mouths. Uncles glared at Arthur and Helen, who were now clinging to each other in absolute, undeniable disgrace. "It's a lie," Vanessa shrieked, her voice cracking. She stepped in front of Julius, holding her arm out protectively. "She's making all of this up. Look at this watch. Look at the ring he gave me. A con artist couldn't afford these things." "He didn't afford the watch, Vanessa," I said gently, looking at my sister with a mixture of pity and sorrow. "I did. Or rather, grandmother's trust did. The money Arthur and Helen wired to his fake company, that was the money he used to spoil you. He has been using our family's wealth to fund the illusion of his own." I turned my attention to the large, ostentatious diamond engagement ring on Vanessa's finger. "And as for the ring, Uncle Richard, could you please read page 14 of the dossier, the section regarding his previous engagement in San Diego?" Uncle Richard, his face grave, flipped open the binder. He adjusted his glasses and read aloud to the silent, horrified room. "In the matter of Stern versus the state of California, it was documented that the defendant, Julius Stern, routinely proposed to his targets using a high-quality cubic zirconia replica mounted in a platinum-plated setting, a tactic designed to simulate immense wealth without requiring liquid capital. Vanessa froze. She looked down at the massive, glittering stone on her hand, her breath hitched. She looked back up at Julius. Julius's mask completely disintegrated. The charming, sophisticated smile vanished, replaced by an ugly, desperate snarl. He looked at Vanessa not with love, but with pure, unadulterated contempt. "Oh, grow up, Vanessa," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "Did you really think a man of my caliber was interested in a spoiled, vapid, failed influencer who still lives off her parents' allowance? You were a mark. Your parents were the easiest, most arrogant marks I've ever encountered. They practically handed me the account numbers because I complimented Arthur's terrible wine collection." The collective shock in the room was palpable. Helen let out a small, strangled sob and collapsed into a nearby armchair. Arthur looked as if he had been physically struck, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Vanessa stood perfectly still. The reality of the situation, the absolute, humiliating truth of her fabricated fairy tale, finally shattered the illusion. The golden child, who had never faced a single consequence in her life, was suddenly standing in the wreckage of her own vanity. She looked at Julius, her eyes wide with a terrifying, absolute clarity. Then, in a single, fluid motion, she reached up to her ear. She unclasped the heavy, $7,000 diamond watch from her wrist. She pulled the massive, fake engagement ring off her finger. Julius took a step toward her, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Now, Vanessa, wait." "Don't touch me," Vanessa said. Her voice was not a scream. It was a cold, low whisper that carried perfectly across the quiet room. She didn't throw the jewelry at him. She didn't cry. Instead, she turned to Uncle Richard. She held out the watch and the fake ring. "Uncle Richard," she said, her voice trembling but resolute, "please take these as evidence. I want to press charges. For whatever I can. Fraud, theft, I don't care. I want him in jail." Julius's eyes widened in genuine panic. He realized the game was entirely over. He spun around, shoving past a caterer, and bolted for the French doors. "Don't worry about chasing him," I said calmly, returning the documents to my briefcase and snapping it shut. "I contacted the local authorities and the FBI field office early this morning regarding his interstate wire fraud. They are waiting for him at the end of the driveway." Right on cue, the flashing red and blue lights of 3 police cruisers illuminated the large windows of the living room, painting the shocked faces of my extended family in a chaotic, rhythmic glow. The downfall of Julius Stern was swift and absolute. He was apprehended at the gates of the estate, his pockets stuffed with silver spoons he had grabbed from the catering tables on his way out. The FBI, utilizing the extensive dossier Marcus Vance had prepared, quickly unraveled his entire network of shell companies. Because he had utilized interstate wire transfers to extract funds from the trust, the federal charges carried a mandatory minimum sent. Julius would not be seeing the outside of a federal penitentiary for a very, very long time. For Arthur and Helen, the consequences were entirely different, but no less devastating. The social humiliation they had spent their entire lives trying to avoid had crashed down upon them in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. The extended family, now fully aware of their staggering financial incompetence and their willingness to commit fraud, completely ostracized them. 2 weeks after the incident at the brunch, I convened a formal meeting at my law firm's offices. Arthur, Helen, and Vanessa sat across from me at the long mahogany conference table. They looked small, exhausted, and utterly defeated. "The trust accounts remain frozen to any discretionary spending," I informed them, sliding a new, incredibly restrictive budget across the table. "I have legally restructured the estate. From this moment forward, the trust will only pay for the basic property taxes, utilities, and a strict, modest grocery allowance. The credit cards are permanently canceled. The country club memberships are revoked. The luxury leased vehicles are being returned tomorrow." Arthur stared at the budget, his hands trembling. Luna, we can't live on this. This is a peasant's allowance. We have appearances to maintain. We have social obligations. You have no social obligations, Dad, I replied evenly. Your society friends no longer wish to associate with you. You have two choices. You can learn to live within this budget, or you can sell the estate and downsize to a condominium. But you will never touch the principle of grandmother's trust again. That money is secured for future generations, not for your vanity. Helen wept silently, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, but she did not argue. The fight was completely gone from them. They signed the new agreements without another word. When the meeting concluded, Arthur and Helen shuffled out of the conference room, looking every bit their age and more. Vanessa, however, lingered behind. She stood by the window, looking out at the city skyline, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She was wearing a simple, unbranded sweater and jeans, a stark departure from her usual designer wardrobe. I'm looking for a job, Vanessa said quietly, not turning to face me. An actual job. A friend of mine manages a boutique downtown. She said she could start me on the sales floor next week. That's a good first step, Vanessa, I said, packing my files into my briefcase. She finally turned around. Her eyes were red-rimmed, devoid of the arrogant spark that had defined her for 29 years. I'm sorry, Luna, she said, her voice cracking. I'm so incredibly sorry, for the watch, for the trip, for the cake. She took a deep breath, fighting back tears. I spent my whole life believing I was the center of the universe because Mom and Dad told me I was. I thought you were just boring. I thought you didn't know how to live. But you were the only one actually living in reality. You were protecting us and we treated you like garbage. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed you to know that I see it now. I see everything. I looked at my sister. For the first time in our adult lives, I wasn't looking at a spoiled princess or a manipulated pawn. I was looking at a flawed, humbled human being who was finally ready to grow up. Forgiveness takes time, Vanessa, I said softly, walking over to her. The damage done over the last 10 years cannot be erased with one apology. We are not going to be best friends tomorrow. There are strict boundaries in place now, and they will remain in place. Vanessa nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. I understand, I deserve that. But, I continued, reaching out and gently placing my hand on her shoulder. You are my sister, and I am glad you are finally awake. If you truly commit to this new path, if you truly start taking responsibility for your own life, I will be here to support that, not financially, but as your sister. A small, genuine, and incredibly fragile smile appeared on Vanessa's face. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen her wear. Thank you, Luna, thank you. 6 months later, the chaos had completely settled. Arthur and Helen had quietly put the massive estate on the market, realizing they could no longer afford the upkeep without the endless flow of illicit trust funds. They were moving to a quiet, unassuming townhouse in a different state, far away from the judgmental eyes of their former social circle. Vanessa was working full-time, living in a modest studio apartment, and slowly, painfully, learning the value of a hard-earned dollar. As for me, I was sitting in my apartment, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the warm air. I was no longer the invisible shield, the unappreciated accountant, the forgotten daughter. I had shed the immense, suffocating weight of their manufactured reality. I walked into my kitchen and opened the refrigerator. The shelves were fully stocked with fresh produce, quality meats, and healthy ingredients. There was no expired milk. There was no half-eaten grocery store cake. I poured myself a glass of cold water and took a long, refreshing drink. The air in my apartment was light, peaceful, and entirely my own. I had fought for my family's legacy, but in the end, the most valuable thing I rescued was my own life. I took a deep breath, smiled, and finally truly felt at peace.